Hello and welcome to the FinTech Finance Virtual Arena, and on today's session we're going to be looking at payments across the world, and joining me are two organisations that have also got their unicorn status, so who better than to bring on for today's session. Now joining me from Checkout.com I have Tracy Mung from Checkout.com. As I said, Tracy, how are you doing here today?
I'm doing well, thanks Doug. Calling
Tracy,
in from San Francisco.
Thank you so much for joining, and could you give our audience a bit of background to your role at Checkout.com and also maybe Checkout.com if they haven't heard of you?
Sure. So I am the Global Head of Partnerships and Partner Engineering at Checkout.com. We are a global payments company and we're headquartered in London with 19 offices around the world, and happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm so excited to kind of hear your guys' perspective on today's topic on conversion rates as well. And also we have Claire Gates from PPro. Claire, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us. I'm doing really well. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm, as I said, Claire Gates. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at PPro. And those who might not have heard of PPro before, we're a global payment infrastructure provider. We enable companies like Checkout.com to offer local payments to their customer base.
Absolutely incredible. Now to kick things off then, Claire, with that in mind, let's look at the big picture before we dive deeper in. Payments have evolved rapidly around the world in the last 5 years alone. I think, even in the last 18 months, you could say. But I'm interested to kind of give us a bit of perspective for what we're about to talk about. What have been some of the biggest milestones that might have caused this divergence within payments?
Mm-hmm. And look, I'm a bit of a veteran in the payments industry because I've been in it for over 10 years, etc. But you're right, what we've seen in the last five years, and let's be honest with you, in particular in the last 18 months. So got to head in there straight away, haven't I? COVID has been an inflection point for the payment landscape. And I think why has it been an inflection point is all of a sudden, many of these larger merchants had to suddenly pivot towards an e-commerce solution. Even if they had an e-commerce solution, some of those bricks and mortar merchants had to suddenly upscale their solutions because there was only one way to acquire goods and services, and that was generally online. Look, the global retail market has changed. It was predominantly offline. Now you've got consumers who are purchasing goods and services anywhere. I often say this, consumers are borderless. You only need to look at a certain demographic, and social commerce is playing a significant role. I think it was some research that came out from the Future Shopper report, and it's a recent one, that said like shoppers generally are now 72% are actually stating that online shopping actually came to their rescue during the COVID. Yeah. And I don't think it was just an age demographic either. We've all got really beautiful examples of people who are, our parents or even grandparents who suddenly found that, they could buy online all their goods and services, including groceries. And I think that was a really good demonstration of how, as our purchasing habits have evolved, and unfortunately, because that situation was protracted over a long period of time, people's purchasing behaviour has changed, and one could argue, are they here to stay?
Yeah, I think that will be a really interesting metric to understand how much payments have changed, as if it has changed forever, and I think almost you can, the consumer changes have morphed over the last 18 months, but also you can look at it in bigger cultural things, in the fact that, for instance, the town that my parents live, there was no way to buy Uber or Uber Eats or Deliveroo, and suddenly all the merchants in that entire town, because of the pandemic, also decided to digitize in that way and get onto the e-commerce journey as well. And it was really exciting to see. And Tracy, can I also get your perspective over there in the States, and kind of see maybe your perspective on, because Claire has brought up the retail side of things as well, what you think's caused the divergence too?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's going to be just because COVID in general has really time warped us all and very easy for us to forget what life was like before. And even just a few years ago, like Claire, I came from a long tenure in payments. And I remember even just a few years ago looking at reports that said that 90% of commerce still happened in store in brick and mortar.
Wow.
And I think we're going to forget that very quickly because now commerce and payments have been so digitized. I think prior to the pandemic, even there was a shift into things like mobile payments, just the proliferation of mobile technology that shift already started, but then the pandemic really accelerated that, to Claire's point. And I think that you see segments, to your point on Doug, on your parents, boomers who are very loyal shoppers now starting to adopt digital technologies for the first time, and that includes payments, whereas before, maybe they were either just not adopting of digital commerce experience, or they just felt like this was not a very secure practice. And then we also see a lot of trends like paying with QR codes, and really just the death of the POS, bypassing the old stodgy devices and being able to innovate more in a digital setting. I think that's been huge for us. I think the other two trends that I would point to, one is just the global economy becoming more interconnected, as we've really found use cases for global money movement. And then that also making localization important, because in order for you to operate at a global scale, you really need to understand the local regulatory or the payment method adoption rates there. In Europe, for example, PSD2 was a huge driver and everything that happened with, banking regulations, but then also opened up the doors for new payments innovation. And then finally, the last trend that I've really seen is on the merchant or the business side, because we talk about consumers a lot because we're all consumers, but really on the merchant and business side, we've seen accepting payments become just a lot more sophisticated. Years back, you as a small merchant would get hit up by what we call in the payments industry an ISO, or an independent seller organization. They would just go door to door reselling payment technology, lots of middlemen, lots of layers, opaque pricing. No one really knew what happened in that black box. Now we're moving into a world where you have technologies like Checkout with single API that covers off on gateway, processing, acquiring, all in one. So you have a one-stop shop to go to that's developer friendly, modular. The merchant can be in full control of how they optimize, how they're paid. And I think that's been, a revolutionary moment for the payments industry as well, because it's a two-sided thing. It's not just the consumers, but it's the merchant adoption that is required for us to really innovate and get to the next level.
And actually, Tracy, just to add on to that, that's a really good point, because what it gives those merchants in tier maybe tier 2, tier 3, if we're thinking of the size ones, is a level playing field versus some of those more mature, what I call the mega merchants, who had, a large infrastructure in-house and a number of people to develop something. So here they get it out of the box and have a really beautiful, seamless experience that they can integrate and offer. And that just optimizes their flows and their processes and the end consumer experience that they can offer.
And I think, if we look at payments holistically around the world, having that ability to level that playing field is going to be so important in that digital world, because if all the large merchants can take up all that digital space, then suddenly mom and pop shops are destined to fail, and especially if everyone is moving to a digital world. So having that level playing field is going to be so important for SMEs going forward. So it's brilliant to hear that innovation. And speaking of Tracy, your second point as well, kind of diving down into each region and seeing how localization has become increasingly important. Claire, I've got to ask, within each region itself, we've seen open banking in various forms, allowing payments to evolve and diverge in different ways with the form of local payment methods that, Tracy brought up some of them. We've seen in Brazil, for instance, boletos, in China, Weixin. What can merchants do in the face of such difference to kind of, if we are trying to level that playing field, how can these mom and pop merchants effectively still accept everyone's payment method.
Yeah, I think we often get asked this, and I think integrating local payment methods generally sounds so easy. It sounds straightforward, but it really is. Of course, I'm going to say that, but it isn't as easy as that, because you can integrate a local payment method. First of all, where do you draw the line at? How many local payments do you integrate? You've got to do the right ones, and you've got to integrate it technically optimal, so that you get the right results. And so therefore you need to find or work with a partner. PPRO is a partner who we have a coverage over 100 plus countries with local payment methods. I think the most important thing is you've got to find the right, depending on the demographic, the product that you offer, the region that you're going to be offering it. Once you've got those things identified, then you need to work with somebody like PPRO, who can help identify this particular local payment method is relevant for your demographic, for your sector, and maybe this one isn't. But what you get when you do an integration with PPRO is a single contract, a single API, and you get that, I suppose, a menu, a suite of local payment methods, depending on, what market you want to go in. But you also get the consultative approach that we could then help you determine which ones are relevant, because there's no point as an organization just deciding, let's go and do land grab, integrate all of these LPMs, because that's also not going to be the optimal solution, and to maximize checkout conversion rates as well.
Yeah. Now, I've actually got to say, Claire, I actually appreciated the use of the word menu, because I think all three of us have been within the payments or interacting in the payments industry for such a long time. The amount of phrases and just terms tossed about that must cause a merchant who is very time poor to effectively just have a headache. If you could say to them, here's a menu of all the different ways you can accept a payment, we need to start embracing that language a bit better, and I think that's going to be so important, because ultimately, Tracy, if I could come to you with this, the bottom line for merchants is that they get paid, and conversion rates are the core to this in an e-commerce COVID-19 world. But they might mean something different to everyone in the ecosystem. So what is the ultimate definition, and why has the definition of a conversion rate actually diverged, as well as payment technology?
Yeah, so I think conversion is, businesses often just dedicate a lot of resources to this, right? Because they want to get their customers into the funnel. There's a lot of investment put into getting that customer to initiate the transaction, to add the widget to the cart, and to ultimately pay for it. And I think the divergence here is really around defining the conversion at the very end, because if you stop at I got someone to add their widget to the cart, or even I got them to enter in their credit card number, you haven't really completed the full life cycle of that payment. And I think what's starting to happen is businesses are starting to invest to ensure that this payment process is as painless as possible, but that also that transaction actually goes through. If it does fail, that's actually the biggest loss to the business, because you've invested so much money into the cost of acquisition of that customer, and you're falling short at the very last step. So I think it's very important to have ultimately a very high bar for your definition of conversion. In my opinion, it's really, has that money gotten into your bank account, into your merchant bank account? That's really the point of conversion. If a customer tries to pay, but the transaction times out, not a conversion. If you have some fraud on your hands where someone makes a transaction, but then the bank declines it, also not a conversion. So I think it's important for merchants and businesses to really look at that last mile and make sure they're going all the way to the point where the money is literally into your bank account.
Yeah, and Claire, just because it's the question is about differing definitions, do you agree with Tracy on that point?
Absolutely, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I love the way that it's actually all the way to that money is actually into the account. It's no use if you've done that sale in the transaction, but there's no money in the account. I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking, if you imagine in the real world, the bricks and mortar perspective, and you can imagine going into either a large retail store, it doesn't matter what, the electronic store, could be a grocery store, store, and you see all of these baskets with goods in, but just being left before the actual tills. How strange and bizarre would that look? Yeah. Okay, and that's ultimately what you've got on a e-commerce. If you're not optimizing that very last piece, you've got them through that funnel, you've got them through the various, lines of goods and the shelves, etc. They've taken what they've wanted, but then they just put that cart and don't actually complete that transaction for whatever reason. That's an unsuccessful process. A lot of money, as you say, is invested in acquiring a customer. So anything you can do to increase checkout, 1 or 2% has a material impact on your lifetime value of your customer. And customer retention, obviously, because of lifetime value, but also the stickiness.
Yeah, and I think it's weird to almost think of customer experience when it comes to payments because it's such a practical topic, but it really does need to be evaluated. And I think customers, especially on e-commerce, are becoming incredibly, not demanding, but at least finally establishing demands that previously, when you were inputting all your payment data and it didn't work on the internet, you just chalked it up to the internet being awful and the process being bad. But now there is a level of expectation, and I think as a result, payments are going to be, as you said, the forefront of what every merchant needs to be thinking about. But ultimately, then, Tracy, at its core, sending a payment is typically as simple. I know obviously it's a highly regulated industry, but it's as simple as sending a small amount of data. So what's causing these failed international payments when we look at the e-commerce space?
Yeah, I love this question, but I'm actually going to go back to the last one and just talk through one more point, which is, we talked about local payment methods earlier as well. And I really think that this is, when you think about designing your payment flow, the reason it's important is one, what Claire and I just talked about, which is that transaction needs to actually go through. So if it times out, that's a poor customer experience. You could also lose the lifetime value of that customer because they just don't want to come back. But even prior to that, as you're thinking about putting the payment methods across the board, we often in the payment industry, and I think Doug, you were making fun of yourself about acronyms and sort of,
Thank you, that was the word.
Be able to keep track of all the acronyms, but I think a lot of payment industry people call, the GiroPays and the P24s of the world alternative payment methods. And I think that's really a misnomer. I think they're actually in those regions primary payment methods. They're local payment methods, but if you have 70% of the population who wants to pay using those payment methods, then they're really not an alternative payment method, they're a primary payment method. So I think it's important for you to create that experience, to understand your customer, to do the research, maybe some A/B testing, so that your customers can actually see when they're checking out, hey, my primary payment method is here, one click, done. I'm going to come back to this merchant and use them next time because it was so easy for me to shop with them. And I think that virtuous cycle is how you build lifetime value with your customers. And that's where, payments becomes actually really important. And so I think going to your current question, which I think is a really good one, how do you actually enable international payments when you're a growing global business? It sounds simple, as we've all talked about, but it's actually, the reason it's complex is the best analogy that I can give is really international travel. I mean, when you're going from one country to another and you have to go through border control because each country has their own regulations and own jurisdictions on what they recognize as legitimate or illegitimate. It's harder for you, it's harder for me to go to France or go to the UK with an American passport. The line is usually longer than, Claire, who can probably, get by very quickly when she, goes to the UK. And the agent doesn't recognize maybe a passport if I'm coming from an even less recognized country, right? So the same is true with payments. If you're going from point A to point B, from the user's bank account to the merchant bank account, replace the border control with the issuing bank and the acquiring bank, because those are the entities that kind of represent the user and the merchant. When I go to use my US credit card to buy a dress from a French boutique, which I actually did recently because I'm getting married.
Congratulations.
Thank you. the French bank may not recognize my bank, or they might flag something as illegitimate just because they don't recognize it, or they're more familiar with the local banks. And that's getting stopped at the border control, which is, at some point along the process of my bank to their bank and them talking together. And all of a sudden, the acceptance rate goes down. My credit card is declined. I'm not able to buy my dress. What if someone can actually walk up with you to that border control and say, I vouch for this credit card. I've seen it before. I know how it works because I have kind of all of the global entities in place and all of the licenses in place to vouch for that. I mean, I think that's really the beauty of the innovation right now, is that there's solutions that can help you, basically shortcut the line as you would in a border control situation, but with payments, help every user really go through that line as quickly as possible and as seamlessly as possible, so that you never lose out on a transaction just because it's cross-border. And that's what a payment solution that encompasses the acquiring and the processing and all of it all in one, and has a large portfolio of licenses across various regions, can do for every single transaction and truly make e-commerce borderless. I think with money in particular, even geopolitical changes like Brexit can really affect these barriers. And you all probably know this very well and very intimately, but that's really where, when you have players, solutions that can help these things line up, when you have the issuing bank, the acquiring bank, the network and schemes all lined up because your provider is able to kind of work through all of this complexity, that's where you're going to have the highest acceptance rates when going cross-border.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds brilliant having that almost, I want to use the phrase, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it's like an end-to-end payment system. And Claire, I mean, do you agree with Tracy? Do you think that is possible to create? I mean, Tracy, you were saying that those innovations already exist. We just need to start implementing them. Am I correct there, Claire?
Absolutely. And by the way, I think the analogy was absolutely, really, really fantastic analogy. I'm going to say, Tracy, I'll probably be using it again myself at some point. But yeah, look, it isn't as simple. I mean, one of the things you asked about is, data, how much data or transferring data. We have this perception that a transaction is straightforward. And then you have this perception that you've got to provide lots of different data. Well, it's actually not about providing huge amounts of data. It's the right data points to enable a transaction to be approved. There is technologies out there, but there's also technologies for a lot of things. It's about the whole package, like you say, the end-to-end solution. Somebody's got experience of knowing how to do it on multiple markets and multiple scale, and can do it efficiently. We've got examples of cases where we've had partners who have potentially tried to go out and directly connect with local payment methods, and there are nuances to each of these. It could take a lot of engineering time, and you need to navigate the complexities of the regulation and the compliance for particular regions. So I would suggest that making sure that they work with the right partners who have experience doing it is key to avoid pitfalls on getting or developing subpar integrations.
Well, with that in mind, then obviously that's going to be just another headache for merchants that they don't want to have to be dealing with. And I'm almost intrigued to find out. And Claire, I'm going to stick with you with this because I know that's really what People works on a lot. Is I'm interested to see what local payment methods have the highest conversion rates, and is there a significant reason for that? Is it just because their digital payment methods have been so entrenched for so long?
Yeah, that could well be it. I mean, I've done consumer lending, and I've done, local payments. I've done a number of things, and there's always people always want to know. Well, I want the most maximum acceptance rates or conversion rates, and of course, it's naturally we all want that. But sometimes it all depends what the profile of the customers who are using that particular payment method is, and the type of payment method. So there are ones that quite clearly have higher conversion rates. I could say things like Ideal, and there'd be ones that relate to buy now, pay later, may have less of a conversion rate, only because of the type of demographic that they are potentially attracting.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, there's so many payment products and so many different ways to pay now. It's almost too hard to kind of narrow down. And I guess, speaking of buy now, pay later, I think that's just another string to e-commerce's bow. So Tracy, as e-commerce goes from strength to strength globally, I think that's fair to say, ensuring a seamless payments experience is going to become increasingly critical. So how can merchants effectively streamline that if they're technically time poor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is, find a provider who can be that fast track border agent for your transactions and ensure that each one of them goes through. I think that's super fundamental in making sure that you're capturing that conversion that we talked about with that really high bar definition, where the money is actually going into your bank account. I think beyond that, there's also, it's also important to balance that with security and with, fraud prevention, because you also don't want fraudulent transactions to come through. So you need to make sure that the provider has great fraud tools as well. And then I think to the discussion that was just had, staying ahead on the trends. So we've talked a lot about local payment methods. Buy now, pay later is obviously very critical to the development of, I think, the future of credit. Really, I mean, there's just so much innovation going on in that space. But also wallets, the one-click pays, anything that you can do to make that payment as seamless and as quick as possible. There's also obviously lots of innovation going on in sort of experiential innovations, such as voice and hands-free commerce, and being able to pay through that. So making sure that if you are a company that we're having those type of experiential experiences are important to your product. Maybe it's refilling on shampoo while you're in the shower. Well, you're not going to get out your phone and buy that shampoo in the shower. If you can tell your home device or your assistant, your digital assistant, to do it, that's a really great experience for the user. And then of course, crypto, that's also another innovation that everyone, I think, should kind of keep track of, how that space is evolving over time as well. So I think with all of that, working with a partner who can adapt quickly is really paramount. When I was at a previous company and we were working with all of the payment solution providers, there were some who just had these multiple layers where you wanted to implement something, but in order to do so, they would have to do it on 5 different platforms because it was all cobbled together through mergers and acquisitions, or the stack was just built in a way that required you to talk to multiple parties in order to get one thing implemented. And I think if you can find a solution provider who can adapt quickly, who is developer friendly, and is able to add on new technologies quickly, that's where you'll stay ahead of your competition as well.
That's absolutely incredible. And speaking of staying ahead of your competition, I've got to say to both of you, congratulations on the unicorn status. And Tracy, as payment ecosystems become increasingly complex, I'm interested to kind of hear from your perspective what's next from Checkout.com.
Yeah. Thanks. We take a really humble approach to things like fundraising, where for us, it's really all about reinvesting into building the best products. We also care a lot about providing the best service we can to our customers and really taking that white glove approach. It's how merchants like Curve, for example, went live over the weekend with the support that we've given them. And we're just really excited about what the future holds and bringing some outstanding new leadership that was recently announced across the C-suite. Leela, Celine, Carrie, important to me personally, just building a diverse, inclusive teams with really strong leaders and continuing to hire the best talent. But ultimately, we feel that we're just getting started. We don't feel like we've reached some milestone where we can rest on our laurels. We really feel like it's as Guillaume always says, chapter 0 in our story.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. Harking back to what you were saying in terms of creating that diverse team, we've been talking this entire conversation about payments across the world and how almost it's not just the technology in payments that's different. It's the way that people interact with their payments and have choice. And to be able to have that at the heart of your organization is going to be so incredible. And also, Claire, as well, congratulations too. Can you tell us and our audience a bit more about what's next for PPRO as well?
Yeah, well, not dissimilar. We're on a journey. It's been exciting times, but there's a lot for us to work and focus on going forward. Yes, we've got 400 plus payment experts today. We see this growing rapidly. We're in 9 locations. And the key thing is having, raised the money. It's about reinvesting and developing a stronger, scalable expansion to our product suite.
Yeah. It just sounds like the future is really going to be payments orientated, and the fact that both of you are right at the heart of that is so exciting, and this conversation has been so insightful for me. And as we were saying as well at the beginning, as we're all consumers as well, so to hear these kind of these topics and nuances is so exciting. And also I just want to say as well a big thank you to our audience as well for watching. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at ffnews.com, and of course YouTube, and especially LinkedIn, where I'll see you in the comments. So Tracy, Claire, thank you once again. I hope you've had a great time. I certainly have. Have a lovely day.